So welcome back, session number 3 in the Venture Launch course. So we're now entering the venture opportunity stage, where we're going to look at imitative venture opportunities. The next session will be innovative venture opportunities. The whole idea is to figure out how and where you can find your opportunities and what consequences that will have for you and your exploitation process. So if we look at this from an economical point of view, most industries are described in terms of supply and demand. So I'm going to show you the classical graph for an industry. So normally you will have price and you will have quantity on this axis, and then you will have a supply curve, and supply is the aggregation of your input, and then you will have the demand curve, which will be the aggregation of all your needs and wants. So everybody that wants to have something that you are selling is the demand, and this point is called something very particularly interesting, equilibrium. So this is where resources are used in the most efficient way. So the classical formula is marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and that is when an additional shirt, the production cost of producing this t-shirt, equals what the last customer is willing to pay for that. And at that point, this entire industry are working at equilibrium. So you're using their resources in the most efficient way. So my question would normally be, how many industries do we have that are working at equilibrium, where the cost of me buying the last product equals the cost of production? And you can think about that for a long time, and I have done that, and there are very few or even zero. So there are some commodities that are potentially working at this space. They are, let's say, wheat. So wheat would be the standardized product. It's sold on a global market. There is 100% free and correct information in relationship to the quality and quantity of each and every wheat harvest in the world. So the margin is very, very low in terms of that in that industry. But otherwise, there is really no industry working at this point. And there are signs that you can look for, and one sign will be that you don't even have something like that. So you will have a monopoly or a governmentally owned industry. Like in South Africa, Eskom is the only allowed power generating company. Well, you will have the private version that have to sell to Eskom, but Eskom control the entire industry. So they can set the prices as they wish. Airline industry, which is also interesting, which is South Africa was actually one of the first countries in the world that deregulated airline industry. So they allowed competition on the routes in the country. The open skies obviously opened up between the Europe and the US at some point in time. And that allowed a lot of low-cost carriers to enter the market. So before when it was a regulated market, you had to pay 5,000–6,000 to go from Cape Town to Joburg or from London to Stockholm, and now you can pay 500. So by opening up a regulated or a monopoly, a lot of opportunities will come into play. On the other hand, you can also look at industries that are very profitable, and there is actually a fair amount of industries that are fairly profitable, and you can guess in almost every country there is a particular one industry that is very profitable, that makes shitloads of money for very little input. And you can think about it, but I can give you the answer, and it's the banking sector. And I will go into an example on that. So if you look at the South African banking sector, or you can look at any country in the world and their banking sectors, they're normally a very high concentration with 3 or 4 or 5 big banks that controls 90% of the market. So high competitive concentration is normally a sign of an inefficient market. The headlines earnings in 2018 was approximately 82 billion rand for the banking sectors, and that's an 8 to 9% year-on-year growth. So it's a very profitable, and it's also growing annually. So that's a good sign of an inefficient market. Cost to income ratio, so some industries obviously have higher costs. In the banking sector it's actually fairly low, so 56% of the income is costs in the banking sector. So you will have agricultural industries where you have, or the restaurant industry will have higher cost to income ratios. That also gives you the play around where you can play around. So if you can start a bank and lower the cost to 45%, you have an additional 10% gain where you can actually either turn that directly into profit, or you can use it as a competitive tool when the banks try to compete with you. Highly kind of large return on equity in the banking sector, so 19-20%. Capitec is one of the last banks to start down here. Have in 2018 had 2.46 billion rand in profit the first 6 months, which is obviously shitloads of money in whatever currency you talk about. And Capitec, obviously after COVID-19 have reduced their value, but up to that point they had a growth in about 20% during those 6 months. So highly profitable and highly or high growth type of company is still allowed in that industry. Competition, 5 large bank controls 90% of the market. It's the highest concentration ever in the South African banking sector. There is an unbanked population in South Africa, give or take 10, 11, 12 million persons that do not even have a bank account, which obviously is an opportunity in itself, because all of them are using money. Technology, a bank today is a computer. In reality, it's a safety system and a transaction system. So before you obviously had to pay, people have to have papers and you wrote stuff in a bank. You don't need that anymore. There is another very sophisticated segmentation of the market. So you will have business clients, you will have private clients or normal clients, and you will potentially have agricultural and potentially some other industries. But just by segmenting your target market a little more efficiently, you could probably tap into that market. There's a high risk segment in the banking sector, people with a lot of debt or bad debt, or people that are not paying their debt. So it's a fairly high amount, but it's also a very kind of high income generating segment. So most of those persons that are in that group would pay interest rates that are 30, 40, 50%. And that is almost pure profit for a bank. It's also actually a regulated market. So whatever you need in order to start a bank is available. So you need a license, and you go to the authority. They actually have to give you a license if you fulfill the criteria. And the criteria is there. So all the information that you need in order to start a bank is actually available. And this is obviously, to me, a very inefficient industry. So if you have 80, 100 billion rand that is going into profits, it's highly inefficient. And if you have a cost to income ratio around 50%, you can also see that there's a lot of cost savings to be made here. And this is the kind of the starting point for the entire fintech boom. So all these new fintech companies are coming out of this equation, because they want to tap into these 80 plus billion rands. One company that I worked with fairly early on is called Klarna, and it's one of the early fintech companies coming out of Sweden. They're now valued to over $6 billion and operational in Europe and in the United States. And the only thing that they did was to tap into a small, particularly part of the banking sector, the payment systems. So they introduced invoicing online. So before, well, 10 years ago, people were a bit afraid of giving out the credit card numbers online because they were afraid of fraud. And also they wanted to have their goods before they actually paid to make sure that they actually got the goods. So they introduced invoicing online, which helped the seller, the ones that are selling the goods, because they will get the money directly. The purchase is gone through on the online platform, and the buyer will get his or her shoes, so they can check them out and fit them on, and it works, and then they pay. So it actually increases the transactions on an online or e-commerce system with 20%, which is obviously super good if you started that company. So instead of thinking about something that I have a problem because I can't find a juice that I like, or I think a restaurant is a good idea. A restaurant is probably the worst idea that you can have, because it's a very kind of cost-intensive operations that are based on an idea of filling every seat to 70, 80, 90, 100% every evening or every lunch, or a combination of them every day in the week. And also the number of licenses and permits you need in order to run a restaurant is 8 or 10 times more than to run a bank, which is obviously very weird. But obviously you need a lot of health things if you have a restaurant that you don't need if you have a bank. And if you look at the entire restaurant industry, the end profit in that industry is actually very low. Most of them are hardly even breaking even. That said, if you systematically want to create high impact businesses, you should look at industries that are not working efficiently. And there are a number of examples from Klarna to one of the more kind of celebrated entrepreneurs, Richard Branson. So he obviously made his money, well, it's family money, and then he did music. And he also now do health, sport clubs, gyms, but also credit cards. So tapping into a small part of the banking sector by issuing credit cards, he actually just cash in on all the transactions that credit card will generate. And his only pitch is that this credit card, it's slightly cheaper than all the other credit cards. So just by working a little bit on the cost side, because he doesn't need to have a central office like FNB, for example, down in CBD in Cape Town, which I was pointing at now. He doesn't need to have 100,000 employees. He doesn't need to have a large marketing department. He doesn't need to have 56% cost to income ratio. So he can go 20% cost to income ratio. And he obviously done that also into the airline industry. Ryanair, another example, if we look at another industry, so obviously the airline industries have never been very profitable, but they've also been regulated. And Ryanair is one of few actually profitable airline companies in the world, and they're a low-cost carrier. So comparing them to, for example, South African Airlines or Lufthansa, is obviously that you have old staff at the state-owned carrier, which is more costly than having young stewardesses and young pilots, because salary is directly related to age. Leasing planes instead of buying planes, so you don't have capital cost, you will just have fixed or variable cost. You don't need a big head office in a fancy part of town, and you also land your plane outside the major cities, which you will have lower landing fees compared to if you land it at Joburg or London Heathrow. And also many municipalities actually paid Ryanair to come to their municipalities because it generated jobs. So they almost landed their planes for free. So if you want to go this road, and most of you will, because you will not be able to do anything innovative, there is a specific logic to this. Because at any given point in time, you will share the exact same idea with thousands of other persons. So if you do not act fast, somebody else will do it. So speed to market, you need to know your supply and demand. So your supply side, if you don't know the cost to ratio in a bank, if you want to do a fintech startup, you should not even consider going there. You should know everything that you can know about the banking sector. And that information is available. You can go into the bank and you could go into the regulator and you can get all that information. Annual report, profits, bank sector information, even interviewing people working in the banking sector. You will get everything you need to know. The demand side, the same. We know exactly how much money that a country is actually playing around with at any given point in time. So if you're going to go for the unbanked population in South Africa, for example, go out there, ask them, figure out what do they do they get money, what do they do when they have money, what could they even use a bank? If they don't have any money, then obviously the banking thing doesn't make sense. If you're going to go for the high debt sector, which a lot of startups do, you need to figure out the default rate. How many of these persons are not actually not going to pay you at any point in time at all? Because that's going to kill your business if you don't know that information. So know your supply and demand, and based on that you develop key kind of performance indicators. How do we measure this so we know that we're doing this efficiently? Competition, it's known and it will be known. So whenever somebody else enters this market, you will know that, and you need to figure out how to deal with that. And the goodies with this type of business is that you could be up and running within a period of 3 to 6 months. As long as you did your homework from the beginning, you would be able to say, this is a 80-90% kind of odds on we being successful, because we already know our demand and supply side. So we can actually go into the banking sector saying that we're going to capture this and this. You can go up to Stellenbosch and you can ask at the Capitec head office. This was exactly what they wanted to do. So they said, let us just go into that sector and buy up all these little micro banks that are available across the country in smaller cities and towns. And then we just aggregate that into one system. And that gives us 20 billion Rand in profit after 6 months in 2018. And the cost of actually buying these banks was not very high compared to that income. And in the slide decks, there's going to be a couple of examples. So this is your first kind of slide that you need to do in your pitch deck that you're going to present at the end of the course. And my advice will always be to focus on single individuals. So as soon as you make decisions on macro data, for example, that there's 80-something billion rands floating around, that doesn't make sense. So when we started this entertainment company, we started to talk directly to the ones that are going to be the artists, the ones that are going to pay to go to the events, the ones that are going to go online and listen to the music, and how they're going to listen to the music. So focus on one person, and that first person should be your customer. Always your customers. And it's not like you go out there and ask a couple of questions on a survey. It's like you actually marry that person. You talk to that person every day to find out exactly when, how, and what they're doing in order to solve this issue that you kind of identified at some point in time. So after this session, we would like you to do, and it will be described on the platform, to look at each and every aspect of that supply and demand combination and try to isolate persons that have knowledge around those things, and then talk to them, ask them, what are they doing, how are they doing this today, cost involved, income involved, and at the end of the day you will have a better idea of this is an imitative venture opportunity or not. So hi and welcome to session 4 in the Venture Launch course. We're going to talk about innovative venture opportunities this time. So we started out with the imitative opportunities, and you might remember the economic graph that I used with supply and demand curves and equilibrium. So innovation in relationship to that is where you create a supply curve. So you come up with something that wasn't there before. You come up with a totally new solution to a problem that potentially been there before, or solve a problem that we didn't have some kind of solution for before. And this session will be about how to find them, how to assess them a little bit, and also the logics, how you exploit them. So if you look for innovation in any form, it's very unlikely that you as a normal person will find that in any way. So when we started out some of our more innovative companies, we either did it through research and development departments at large corporations or at the university. There is a billion reasons to find innovation at the university. There are researchers at UCT, for example, in anything from music and dance to biophysics and nuclear power. The trick is to find somebody that actually knows something that could be the foundation for that innovation. And the trick is to not turn that person into an entrepreneur, if we want to call them like that, because then you basically take away your competitive advantage. You take away that key knowledge that person is the only one potentially in the entire world that sits on. So what we did when we started Spatial Transcriptomics was that I basically walked around at the Royal Institute of Technology, knocking on doors, trying to see what people were doing, and obviously they looked at me as a very, very strange person. What are you doing here? So if you are a professor, obviously it's easier, but if you're a student, that's even more easy to enter into the university and also to enter different spaces of the university. And you don't necessarily need to go to the professor. You can go to your student fellows in various departments and see what they are doing in their master or postgraduate research or their PhD research or beyond that. Because that's where you potentially will find an innovation. And you will not necessarily understand it. So the person that you interact with need to be able to explain to you in some kind of layman terms what that actually means. So when I met, in this case with the Spatial Transcriptomics, I met Jonas, which is one of these wonder kid professors who was a professor when he was 23 in genetics. So his research area is Alzheimer's and cancer. So really, really nasty stuff. And he had this solution where potentially, if you use that, you will be able to approach the cure and also diagnostics for these really, really terrible diseases. And obviously that is attractive. If you look at this from a pure business perspective, if you have cancer and you will die within 6 months if there is no way of curing that, and there is a new way of curing that, you would probably pay whatever you can to kind of get out of that. Alzheimer or ALS is equally bad. And obviously here you need to have some kind of value base, because at the end of the day you can actually charge whatever for that. There's always going to be people that have enough money to buy that cure. But the good thing with that innovation was that it was possible to explain. So it is a fairly straightforward thing where you take two different technologies. So one would be gene sequencing and one would be tissue arrays, and you combine them, and at the end of the day you get a 2 or 3 dimensional space where you have the genes, the genome, the RNA located in your tissue. And nobody done that before. So that was the definition of the pure innovation, that was something that wasn't there before, but now we had it. The good thing was also, this was not something, because if you find innovation, you will need to prepare your business for a long run. So if we talked about 3 to 6 months for imitative ventures, you would talk about 3 to 10 years for innovation. So when we talked about, together with Jonas and Joachim, the other founder, we talked about an investment period in time and effort for 3 years, and then a monetary investment period for 3 additional years, and potentially a product or service on the market after 6 years. We were actually a bit faster than that. So within 4 years, we had a product on the market, and we're generating income, which is extremely fast in terms of an innovation. But it was also, at some point, we had over 40 people working full-time, PhDs mostly on the development of the product. From an investment point of view, it's a high-risk project, but if you, at the end of the day, say something like, we're going to provide a diagnostics for cancer, investors are more likely to invest in that than if you say, we're going to open up a coffee store or a coffee chain or whatever else. The main challenge when you enter a market with such an innovation is that nobody knows what to do with it almost. So in this case, a researcher, before we entered the market, were able to study up to 3 or 4 genes simultaneously, and they will pay approximately $2,000 per gene, and this is a couple of years back. And we were saying to them that they could get all the 22,000+ genes in one run in tissue. And for them, they was like, is that even possible? You must be kidding us. And how much do you want for that? Yeah, we will say we would like you to pay $10,000 for that. So it's a bit more expensive, but per gene, it's actually very, very cheap. But they were just coming back to us and saying, we don't even know where to start if we get 22,000 genes. We are used to 3. So what can we do with all that information? So we needed to actually develop a software that screened out enough information. So we didn't go full innovation. We kind of reduced the innovativeness of the product so it would fit the market better. So if somebody was looking into breast cancer, for example, there would be 5 to 6 indicators, different gene indicators, and we will reduce the amount to those maybe 10 or 15 that are more likely to be of interest for that researcher. And then at some point in time, obviously, this is a very capital-intensive type of business because we have to educate the entire market. So you need to have strong and long-term investors, both in terms of staff and in terms of investors. There are a number of companies that are trying to do this in a systematic way. In a European context, we have Serendipity Innovation. So it's run by 2 other bald guys like me, and they have started 10 or 11 businesses like this, basically going around universities in Sweden, picking up innovative things that they think would make it to the market within a reasonable time period. And they have a mechanism or a process that allows them to do this that is efficient from both their side as an investor and owner and from the researcher. Because at the end of the day, if you work with researchers, you do not want to take them out of research because they need to be there in the front line to develop the next version of your innovation, because otherwise somebody else smarter than you will do that. So it's all a competitive game. You will look in the material, a couple of the examples that came out of the Serendipity Innovation. It was also put on the Stockholm Exchange 5 years ago with very good terms. Then if you look across, so innovation is also not just a concept that happens in the beginning of the life cycle. So a life cycle will be starting out with the innovation. In our business, it was the array and the software. And then we already see different clones or copies of that. We also see smaller pieces of that you can also have as a business. So just the array, the glass that we use in that particular product, that is sold in itself, and that is in itself a business at this point. It wasn't there before. And as an industry mature, you will start working with different types of innovation. So in the early days, there was some kind of disruption, and then you will have product innovation, you will add stuff. So if you look at the normal phone, so I'm so old, so when I was a kid, we only had one phone in the house, and it actually had a cord. So whenever there was somebody calling on that, we all run and try to answer it, and it was in the kitchen or in the hallway. And then at some point in time, you can actually get an extension to that phone. So you can actually bring the phone into the toilet if you have a very secret type of conversation with your potential girlfriend or something like that. But otherwise, it was just one phone. But based on that, as you know today, we have a range of product innovations coming out of the phone up to what we have today, the mobile phones and different variations, all the way up to satellite phones. So if we look at across the life cycle of an industry or a product, you take the classical phone as an example. So obviously, Lars Magnus Ericsson is actually a Swedish inventor that at least commercialized the phone in Europe, and obviously Bell was the original innovator. But at some point in time, that was also turned into other innovations. So when the kind of industry and technology developed, we got various forms of product innovations, like the mobile phone. And even with the mobile phone, we had companies like Sony, Ericsson, Motorola, that were all almost killed by iPhone, which at some point in time introduced their new kind of platform-based phone. So a platform innovation is also introduced at some point in time. You will have various application innovations. So based on the mobile phone, you could also send SMSs. So Nokia was the ones that innovated the SMS, and they made a lot of money on the rights to use the SMS platform. As you enter some kind of maturity in an industry, you can look at various types of process innovation. So we went online, and when we went online, Amazon came along and they introduced one-click buying. So you register once at Amazon, and then you can buy anything with one click, which obviously drives a lot of consumption, which is obviously very good for Amazon. Integration innovation. So some of you might worked in large department, HR, finance. You will have SAP, which integrated everything from bookkeeping to staff and HR processes. There will be line extension. So we also have companies coming out of this. So instead of doing SMSs, you have WhatsApp, which is kind of an SMS service, but it's just another version of it. Marketing innovation. So there is low-cost carriers. So you will have the classical MTN, and then there will be the low-cost Liquid Telecom or something like that will use another way of selling your business. Or even the large corporation have something like called Raspberry or Strawberry, which is the low-cost version of the MTN subscription model. At some point in time, when you decline in the industry, you can start working with business model innovation, for example, the low-cost carriers like Ryanair, value chain innovation, where you take away middlemen or middle persons or middle organizations, like Dell did when they introduced the computer direct. So instead of going to a store buying your computer, they basically allowed you to order the computer online, and then they produced it and delivered it to you at home. And at some point in time, you can work with experiential innovation and structural innovation, which are basically using different platforms to solve the same problem, but they're more efficient. For example, Visio, which is a way of graphically describing complex systems, which was acquired by Microsoft a couple of years ago. So innovation is just not the first innovation, it's also all these kind of follow-up innovativeness types of businesses or opportunities that come along one early innovation. But from a general point of view, finding innovation and exploiting innovation is much more difficult than doing it with imitative venture opportunities. And the major reason is that you don't really know what will happen. There is no supply, there is no demand. So you have uncertainty built into the process. So the reason that we said we're going to go 3 + 3 years was that we need that much time in order to know what we're going to do, how we're going to put it into the market, and who's going to be our customer. If you have an imitative opportunity and you're selling airline tickets, you can pretty much know exactly how many customers you will have if you say we're going to sell a ticket from Cape Town to Joburg for 499 Rand. That's almost a fact. But if you come up with some kind of teleportation that takes you from Cape Town to Joburg without the airport or the airplane and without being COVID freaked out, you don't really know what you're going to charge for that. You can probably charge a lot more, but you don't know. So from a business point of view, when we talk about uncertainty, we have no way of calculating the odds. When we talk about risk, like in imitative, the classical example would be the urn with 5 blue balls and 4 red balls. And when you pick a red ball out of the urn, you can calculate the odds of picking a red or a blue ball out of the urn. With uncertainty or innovation, you might have an urn, but you're not necessarily sure. But if you have an urn, you have no idea what's in the urn. So if you pick something out of the urn and it is a blue cube, there is no way for you to know what the next pick's going to be. So the logic is very different when you talk about innovative startups. Then you first need to verify the need, and that includes an educational procedure where you have to educate the market about their need. You need, as soon as possible, develop a prototype and test that. And then based on those two, you can create the demand. And when you create the demand, you have to pay because it's probably going to be costly and take a lot of time. And in my experience, you're going to have a proof of concept not 3 months, maybe 3 years down the road. So if you personally engage in this type of business, I would normally say in general terms, you should be able to say, I'm going to stick around for 3 years, regardless of business. But if you talk about innovative stuff, you should stick around for 6 years, because that's what you need to invest in terms of time. And that's only at that point in time we can also see some kind of return on investment here. Just giving you a couple of examples, and they're all pretty well described in the material. So with the spatial transcriptomic, there was 2 problems that we tried to solve. The research problem, finding de novo solutions on really, really bad and scary diseases. So that's obviously a relevant problem. And then the second problem was diagnostics. So today, if you have cancer, the doctor takes a tissue, they take a photo of the tissue, put the tissue under a magnifier, and then they basically take a pen and write over areas where they perceive to be aggressive growth, cancer. So in our method, we can get an objective diagnostic based on digital images. So after a lot of images, obviously, we can potentially deliver a more exact solution or diagnostics, which will allow doctors to treat cancer in a more efficient way. So today, if you have breast cancer, for example, there's very few treatments, so they basically cut off your breast. But if there is a little bit more personal diagnostics, some might be able to live with it or use another treatment like chemotherapy or something like that. Based on that, obviously your major talking point as I said in the first session, will be who's going to use this the first time. So if you're going to go innovation, you need to talk to the ones that are going to be the user of that from the beginning. So in our case, we were looking at research customers, so professors, lead professors in their field, cancer, ALS, Alzheimer's, and stuff like that. And it took us almost a year to just approach them. And then our breakthrough was a scientific paper published on the innovation. So they actually had to use what we used. To sum up, innovation, very few of you will ever see it. But if you do, it could be the Holy Grail. It could make, or basically make, a solution that will impact millions or even billions of persons around the globe. So don't shy away from it, but also go into it with open eyes. This is going to be costly, it's going to take time, it's going to be uncertain, and there's really no way of knowing the upside. So you need to figure that out before you go into that road. Somebody needs to go there, otherwise we're just going to have inefficient solutions forever. So I'm not kind of discouraging anybody to go there, but be aware. And obviously I've been there, and I truly enjoyed the ride, so I can recommend it to you too. Thank you.